If you'll go ahead and come on in and find a seat, we'll prepare to start our lesson. So I hope everybody is doing okay today. I figured we'd have kind of a slack crowd with a lot of people traveling, and we need to remember those people that are on the road traveling, and hope everybody has a safe, enjoyable, productive Labor Day weekend. Caleb, I don't see this morning in here, so I'm not sure where he is, but we have talked. Our quarterly system is kind of out of whack right now. He wanted to finish up some stuff, and I understand, looking at James and Philip, that some of the classes have concluded, and I'm not sure. It's my understanding that the class that we've been studying in here, which is the Hebrew Bible, is we'll kind of continue with that for another couple of weeks, and hopefully get back on track with things after this is over with. I'm going to be traveling some, and so my schedule is kind of up in the air too. But I'll be here definitely the majority of September, and then if we need to change or somebody else starts a regular quarterly class, then we'll go from that. Sorry, I saw a notice this morning that there's a lot of pollen, and I think I've been subject to the pollen, so I may have to catch my voice a little bit. So Joan and I got an opportunity a week ago, spent a week in D.C., Washington, D.C. Saw some stuff that we've never seen before, a real opportunity of that. If you've not been in the class, what we've been studying for the last 3-4 months actually has been about the Hebrew Bible, about how it came into existence, the purpose of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the places that we went was to the Museum of the Bible. How many of you have had an opportunity to go there? Anybody? Josh has. So it was really, I think, kind of affirmative to me. I was tickled to death to see that a lot of the things that we have studied in this class, and hopefully you are superficially familiar with, was presented in the Hebrew Bible, the Museum of the Bible. I didn't know what to expect. But there was a lot of history there. I was struck by the fact, and I think that you'll understand what I'm talking about. There was never an effort in those 5 stories, big building. There was never an effort to defend the Bible. It had no agendas. It was strictly a historical aspect of the Bible. And so that anybody that came in could get a concept of the Bible. You know, it's up to our individual study to determine what's in the Bible and the truthfulness of the Bible. But there was so much that was there that I thought was very appropriate. You remember one of our handouts that we did had what was called a stela. Do you remember that? It was a representation, a stone-type representation of some of the ancient documents that were written on stone. And actually saw that exact same stone there. Now, most of the things there, and I didn't know this, most of the things are copies or representative of the originals, which are basically stored all over the world, but these are exact replicas of all of this information. So I learned a lot, And, the confidence, I guess, it instills on what we've been studying, I think, was pleasing to me to know that. But I would encourage you, if you ever get an opportunity to go, please take advantage of that. A couple of observations too, which has nothing to do directly with our lesson today, was another entire story of the building. Was talking about more current events and how the Bible has been used to establish, quote, authority from a political sense. I think that, and I agree with this, it didn't say yay, nay, or whatever, but it presented the arguments. The authority of the Bible has been used historically in ways that I don't think are appropriate. For instance, during pre-Civil War times, many people use that authority of the Bible to establish the aspect of slavery and the fact that slavery was correct and could be interpreted that. People use the authority of the Bible to counter that, to say that it's absolutely wrong. One of the places that we went was to the Holocaust Museum. And I was very struck by the fact that Nazi Germany used the same authority of the Bible to establish adherence to the state and completely dissected and misused the Bible according to their political agenda. It was very striking of how quickly they gained control of Germany and surrounding areas within the matter of a year or so. A lot of things that I've learned but had forgotten on there. Several things that were striking to me. One of the things was talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. You may or may not be familiar, but Jehovah's Witnesses basically pledge no allegiance to a country per se, no matter where they are. They do not believe in military service. They do not believe in killing. The Nazis used that, and I did not realize how significantly impacted that group of people were because they refused to adhere or participate in any of the Nazi regime. There were approximately a couple of thousand of them that were imprisoned and executed just like the Jews were because of that. But what was really striking to me, and I think gives us pause to think, is that there's not one incidence of that group of people who remained in Germany. Not all of them did, some of them fled. There's not one instance of them recounting their allegiance to God, and they could have gotten out of prison. They could have been freed by doing that, but not one instance of that. Now, folks, this is not 2,000 years ago. This is not us in the arena. This is us with a government. And I ask myself, what would my position be? Would I have the courage to stand up for what I believe in and the risk of suffering death? Just a pause for something. Another thing, we went to the U.S. Capitol. There are two statues that each state has in the Capitol. It can be changed by the state. One of the ones that Alabama has is a statue in the Visitor Center to Helen Keller. It's very striking. I took a picture of it. Very striking because she's got her hand at the fountain and water's running out over it. And it's very impressive. One of the books that Nazi Germany, when they were doing all their book burning, one of the books that they burned was Helen Keller's story, because they did not want anybody that suffered severe handicaps to realize that there was a purpose in life, that they could accomplish something to do. So again, just a lot of I thought interesting stuff that sometimes times change and history changes, but truth does not change. Billy Nichols?
Well, what was the other thing in there that other than Helen Keller from Alabama? What was the other thing?
The other statue is not in the Visitor Center. It was presented, actually, I looked it up, Billy. I had no idea who it was or what it was, but of course I was interested when I saw Helen Keller. The other one was a statue to a Confederate general put in there in 1925. You've heard of Fighting Joe Wheeler. The only reason that I can think, first thing I thought was maybe that in the capital of the United States, maybe that should be more representative. But I looked in the history of Joe Wheeler. He was considered to be one of the outstanding cavalry generals by Robert E. Lee. He retired in the late 1800s. He had a definite turnaround and was very instrumental in trying to forge reconciliation and connection between the North and the South. So there was obviously a good side to him. We all learn from things that we've done. We all learn from mistakes, and he obviously realized that we were better united than we were separated. So, but that was the other one, Billy. All right, let's get started. If you got a handout, and I hope you do, we're going to talk about poetry in the Bible. And we're going to specifically look at Psalms 29, Psalm 29. So I'll give you just a moment if you did not get a handout to do that. But while we're waiting, realize that poetry in the Bible is very prominent. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it makes up somewhere between 25 and 30% of the Bible, mostly, of course, in the Old Testament. But numerous references in the New Testament, too, to different poetry and Psalms and Proverbs, and a lot of this is poetic. Not dialogue, but just poetry. How many of you enjoy poetry? Any hands? Probably not as many as there used to be, but I don't think there's an emphasis on poetry. But I've been interested in this, and this is an open-ended question that if you ask people, if you went to a deserted island or abandoned and knew that, what book, other than the Bible, what book would you take to that? And for a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me, they select a book of poetry to take with them. Why do you think that's so? And what's the relevance to poetry in the Bible?
Poetry captures a lot of the human experience and emotions and snapshot of a smaller thing, and so it can be inspiring or comforting, or it's something you can really relate to.
Anything else? Deborah?
Whatever your emotions are has something to do with how you interpret that poetry.
Okay.
So it can change.
Okay. So our perspective can determine what it says to us. Okay. How about the conciseness of poetry? Now, not all poetry is all that concise, but a lot of it is. I personally find that you really have to delve into poetry to understand that there's rarely, most poems anyway, most poems take thought, and yet there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of expression, there's a lot of meaning in a very finite space. John?
Robert Frost said that poetry is the best words in the best order.
Best words in the best order, yeah. Pretty concise.
Personally, I would take Shakespeare.
Did you teach English? What did you teach? English, yeah. So that comes from a
Not
true.
poetry, and I would tell my students in my essays, especially my college students, whatever you see in this poem, you can back it up and what you're good. And I don't, unless we talk to the poet, we don't really know everything.
And that's a very interesting aspect, exactly what we want to keep in mind when we read poetry from the Bible, is there's often a movement, I think, to say that what we read on the page is open to our interpretation, how we look at it. We fail, I think, oftentimes to understand that when the author wrote something from a historical perspective, from a biblical perspective, that they were trying to convey a meaning, that they had an agenda of communication. And it's always incumbent upon us to at least try to put ourselves in the position of the one who wrote the poetry or wrote the Bible. What was their thinking at the time that they wrote it? What were they trying to convey? Not necessarily what we want to always convey. Now, Deborah, I understand where you're coming from, is that there's an emotional aspect that is ability to convey to us based on our situation or our presence, or whether we're on the mountaintop or whether we're in a cave somewhere. Our perspective will change. Their intent did not necessarily change. It was based upon that. Does that make sense to you? It certainly does, I think, to me. And so, with that being said, let's look at this. Psalm 29. Like the version that's in your handout on it, because I think it relays a lot of the actual meaning. Let's read that. And I want, as we read this, for you to look and see what kind of connections that you can make. See if you can see things that are repeated in here. Or things that, expressions or words that are used, or I guess patterns would be a good word to use. Give to Yahweh, O sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. Give to Yahweh the glory due his name. Worship Yahweh in the majesty of his holiness. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is majestic. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf, Mount Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of Yahweh strikes with flashes of fire. The voice of Yahweh shakes the desert. Yahweh shakes the deserts of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh shakes apart the oaks and strips the forest bare. And in his temple, everything shouts glory. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as King eternal. Yahweh gives strength to his people. Yahweh blesses his people with peace. That's a beautiful reading, isn't it? Beautiful, beautiful verse. When you look at that, what strikes you pretty quickly? Now, we're not judging anybody, and I'm not teaching Joan an English course on Shakespeare, so you're not going to be graded on it. What strikes you, what stands out to you right off the bat?
Yahweh is in charge.
Yahweh, repeated Yahweh, right? That he's in charge. What else?
Glorification, God.
The what, Laurie?
Glorifying God over and over.
Okay, all right. I heard somebody else over here. Power. Okay. Anything else? The what? Repetition and parallelism. And John, you can wait in the back because you don't need any of this now. See, what's repeated in this? We're going to Yahweh. Obviously, is repeated over and over and over again. April. He's saying what? I can't hear. Strength. Okay. Whose strength? His strength. Okay. So look at how often voice is used. Voice. The voice of Yahweh. If you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the voice of Yahweh comes over. There's a Hebrew word for voice called kol. Kol Adonai, the voice of God. In Hebrew, and we've gone over this before, in Hebrew language, there are a lot fewer words than what we have in the English language, so there's a lot of interpretation that has to take place. Coincidentally, I was struck. A lot of what we looked at or saw in that Museum of the Bible dealt with the development of the Bible from a language position, how it developed. I'm telling you, we take for granted the Bible that we're able to pick up and read today. A lot of people went through a lot to give us that ability to have what we have. It was not an easy process to do. And politically, it was not easy to do. One of the things that I saw was John Wycliffe translated from Latin into the German language and had to go through a lot of hoops to do that, and because he was opposed so much. If I'm not mistaken, this is the one that was strangled and burned at the stake, simply because he wanted the Bible to be translated so that the common person would have the ability to read it. It used to be considered that in Latin it was only for the nobility and the higher ups, and this has taken place time and time again. One of the things like kol, Q-O-L, can be interpreted, that Hebrew word can be interpreted in different meanings, different ways. It can be a voice, just kind of like a radio is playing a voice, kol. It can be interpreted, in this instance, the kol of God, the call of Yahweh, the voice of God. It can be the same thing in here, a sound like thunder. Thunder can be incorporated and comes from that word. I did not fully understand either, and this again is not related to poetic license or anything, but it gave an example in some of the things that we were going through, and one in particular, that there was a word in Hebrew that can be translated or interpreted 23, I believe, different ways. 23 from one word. Can you imagine, if you have been tasked with translating the Bible, how to do this in an accurate way so that it has the meaning, again, John, the meaning that it was intended to have, not necessarily the meaning that we want to convey on it, but what did the person writing this in Hebrew, what were they trying to say? And there's a big difference in interpretation of what we have. So again, keep that in mind. So as we continue this, we find that the voice of Yahweh is over and over. That's, as John said, is a repetitive nature of Hebrew poetry, biblical poetry. When you read that in things, it takes time to, kind of grasp that and comprehend it. And when we tend to cursory read over poetry in the Bible, I think that's a mistake that we make, is that we get in too big of a hurry in order to do that. We need to take time to read that, to try to figure out what was intended when that poetry was read. Let's look at some other instances here. What places do you see that jump out at you? Physical places that are referenced in this psalm. And does any of them have any meaning to you? Mount Sirion. Do you know what Mount Sirion is? Not a clue. It's a good time when you read things like there, it was put in there for an intent. Mount Sirion is the same as Mount Hermon. So it helps if we can grab a concordance or a Bible dictionary or a map or something and found out. Mount Hermon is up in the north, if I'm not mistaken, around where Lebanon is. It mentions Lebanon several times in here. What is significant about Lebanon? Cedars from the temple. We often assume when we say cedar tree, we're familiar with cedar trees, right? I've cut down a cedar tree for a Christmas tree. These are not the cedars that the biblical talks about in Lebanon. As James said, these were imported to build the temple with. They're huge trees. They would be more appropriate, I think, than when we look at sequoia trees or redwoods. They're large. They're huge. That's in there for a purpose. What else is significant about Lebanon? Where is it located? The north part, and it's mountainous. It's a beautiful country from what I understand. I've never been there, but parts of it are very, very pretty. But it's elevated so that a person that's standing on Mount Hermon in Lebanon or near Lebanon would have a visual aspect to overlook basically the entire country. It gives more meaning when you look and it talks about the voice of Yahweh is over the waters. Can you imagine standing on the top of a mountain looking out at the Mediterranean Sea and you see what developing? A storm, a bad thunderstorm that's developing, moving inland, it hits the mountains and moves south. And you have the destruction that goes along with that. And then it gets into this aspect of the voice is majestic. What does majestic mean to you? We read that word. What does it mean? What's the root word? Majesty. Okay? So who is majestic? That God deserves the honor that He deserves the honor that He deserves. And so we pay attention to that aspect. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf. It jumps. You ever been around the thunderstorms where we jump? Not from a fear aspect, but from a physical aspect. Your house may be constructed a lot better than mine. But I have been in thunderstorms and hurricanes to where the foundation is shaking because the ground is literally reverberating. And I can only imagine that this would be the same thing. Mount Sirium, Mount Hermon, like a young wild ox. A lot of power there, a lot of power. Let's look at this aspect of verses 1 and 2. Give to Yahweh, O sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. Give to Yahweh the glory due His name. Where is this taking place? It says the final and fourth line says, worship Yahweh in the majesty of His holiness. Where is this taking place? It would be in the temple. That's where it would be occurring. That is in the temple. This aspect of the waters, I think, is very interesting, and there are a lot of people who believe that this is a direct connection, a direct link to Genesis, chapter 1 through 3, 4, and that aspect of things, that God is in control of His creation, basically. I thought it was very interesting. I went back and read those parts of Genesis, chapter 1, right off the bat. What does God do with the waters? You remember? He separates them. He puts a layer of water above, and He puts a layer of water below, and He separated that by land. What happened during the flood? And it actually, I think, mentions flood somewhere in there.
Didn't the water come from
Yeah.
the underground?
It did, yeah. In verse 10, Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. When He created the world, what did He do? He separated the water, didn't He? When He caused the flood to happen, what did He do? The exact opposite. He, instead of separating it, He caused water to boil up from the springs of the earth, if you read the narrative that you find in Genesis on it. He released the water that had been separated from above. And they call it in different ways, in different ways, this separation. But the most, I think, accurate was that God had created a dome over and between the heavens and the earth on it. There's a whole lot of connection that I think that we can read into this, talking about the majesty of God and his enthroned power and the connection that there is between our limited ability to think and imagine and God's ability to think and the relationship that he wants us to have. David?
Verse 2 here where it says, worship the Lord in holy way. Look how we're dressed. We give the Lord respect. How we act, how we plan, how we're dressed.
And he's due that respect, isn't he? As our God, he's due that respect. Any other comments?
Hey, Joel.
Yeah.
There in verse 3:2, over the waters, that's in Genesis 1:2 as well. The Lord, our God, was hovering over the waters.
Yep.
You literally got the same.
Verbiage being used there.
Yep, exactly. There's another connection if you go back and look. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, I believe, it talks about the voice of God. Do you remember the circumstances that occurred during this particular time? The voice of God? Adam and Eve had just committed the initial sin. And it said that God came most of the time. That's interpreted what time of the day? In the cool of the day. But I think that probably gives us a misperception of what that was intended to do. I think that's intended to say that God came with his power with a lot of wind taking place. And it gives, I think, more meaning when we say that Adam, what does it say about Adam? That he was what? With the voice of God, that he was afraid. Now, you know, looking at this poem, we can understand the voice of God, the power, the respect that he would encompass. But if you combine that with the wind of God, there was reason for Adam to be fearful, I think, when God came. Certainly the realization that they had done wrong. That, you know, probably had a big impact of that. But just the presence of God under those circumstances, I think, had to be tremendous on there. In our time left, which is just a few minutes, I want to point out one other aspect of this and one other thing. So Joan has talked about the parallel aspect of it, the repetitive nature, and by parallel, we're just talking about one line emphasizing another line, emphasizing another line, and that's pretty common in biblical Hebrew poetry. So that you've got maybe 3 lines, and then a 4th line is an addendum to that, or a change, or almost like you were expecting a 4th line to be the same as the first 3, and they're not. It's like kind of a gotcha, a surprise type ending to it. But here's another very common aspect. Look at the first stanza, verses 1 and 2. So it tells us how we are to look at God, how we are to serve God, how we are to honor and to worship God, that we are to give him acknowledgement and the power of God. Look at verse 10 and 11. And in his temple, everything shouts glory. Glory is not the first time that it's mentioned. It's mentioned in verse 2. Yahweh sits enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as King eternal. Now look at 11. Yahweh gives strength to his people. Yahweh blesses his people with shalom. What is a result of us being in a proper relationship with God? Do what? When we give, the Bible says in this poem that we receive. And exactly the same description as the same way that we honored him. Isn't that amazing? To think that God wants us to be on the receiving end of the same power that he has. That's a lesson that I think should not be lost on us as we look. And look at where this is found. In one poem from the Bible. There's messages in everything that we read. So I guess we need, and you know, there's a whole ball of wax and a rabbit hole that I guess you could go down and see. But I can think of so many different aspects of Jesus' teaching when he talks about, you know, the power that we receive if we only have what? Faith. You know, the connection that God wants us to have with him. And we look at those verses and say, yeah, I know it says it, but man, I can't move that mountain. And yet, the connection between God and man, I think, is deep and significant and has aspects that we can only try to comprehend what it is. You know, I think it gives me meaning when God says he's left this comforter, he's left his Holy Spirit with his children, and the power that he wants to leave with us if we would only accept what he wants to give us. So, I don't know. There's a lot of messages here, and a lot of things that we didn't cover. So we'll see where we go. James, were you going to say something?
I was just, in terms of the poetic aspect of this, if there's any foreshadowing of Christ, because as I'm thinking, you know, it emphasizes the voice, and what is the voice used for? Expressing words. And then when you look at, you know, the word of Yahweh is over the waters, and you think about Christ calming the sea, you think about Christ walking on water, and then in verse 7, the word of Yahweh strikes the flat fire. The actual the New American Standard and the Hebrew word there in verse 7 is divides the flame of fire. You think about the tongue of fire on the day of Pentecost. And I think there's probably a little deeper messianic tie here that we may be missing.
Very well could be. I've never really thought about that, but a lot of commonality in this. I think it gives, when you look at the metaphors that are used in this instance and throughout a lot of poetry, you know, the examples, the analogies that Christ used when he was doing is pretty significant too.
Verse 8, you know, the word of Yahweh shakes the desert. You know, a lot of Christ's teachings were performed out away from the town. Just a thought.
So a lot of power. If there's nothing else as we conclude, I want you to remember this, because it certainly rings home with me. Somebody didn't sit down with this and write roses are blue. What is it? Roses are red, violets are blue. That's my level of poetry. It's pretty obvious that somebody that wrote this poem was so in tune to God that they spent a lot of time in developing this. And if they did this on one poem, this was David, by the way, if they did this on one poem in acknowledgement of God, they also put an inordinate amount of time in doing the same thing. Let's not take it for granted.